This week's Eldritch Lorecast, we give James an opportunity to talk all about Zelda dungeons and our general concept for game design. Is everything just a dungeon? All that and more now.
Oh, I have a wildlife story today! Boom! Spider event yesterday.
I knew that it was just overrun with spiders.
You do get a lot of the bugs and whatever, but yesterday specifically, this huge huntsman was in the house, just right near the front door though, so we were like, this isn't gonna be too hard to deal with. And spraying it did nothing. The thing was just not even reacting. And so then you hit it with the broom and it falls down and you're like, yes, I will now kill it. But it wouldn't die. And so then my mum is like sweeping it out the front door. She's like, it tried to run back in, but I got it. I look down the corridor and it is crawling up the back of her leg. And I had to like sprint to the rescue. I'm like, give me the broom!
You said you wanted to go to Australia, James?
Oh, wow, this is vile. This is deeply upsetting.
Yeah.
Anyway, now that we've thoroughly creeped ourselves out, hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 D&D and tabletop RPG podcast in all of the planes. That's right, the vampires heard the Eldritch Lorecast and the dark fall began. My name is Ben Byrne and I'm here as always with Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. And James, I have to ask, when you first came to, let's say 5th edition, because we're going to be in that realm later this episode. When you first came to 5th edition, what was the first adventure that you played through?
I ran a very little amount of Tyranny of Dragons, the first 5e adventure when it came out. But the first one that I ran as a DM to any level of completion had to be Princes of the Apocalypse, the second.
Right, gotcha. Is that I don't hear a lot about that.
It's kind of one of the forgotten 5e adventures. It was written by Sasquatch Game Studios rather than Wizards. It has a very sort of mega dungeon approach to it, and I think for a lot of people that can be a turnoff. If it can feel like a bit of a disjointed adventure, that is a strength and a weakness of it. It can be very single-minded, but also that gives DMs a lot of latitude to mess with it in whatever way they want without messing up the structure of the adventure. Which is what I did. I had my party go on a detour of the elemental planes in the middle half of that adventure. That was definitely not in the text, but it suited the material very well. And I was able to pull back the dungeons and repurpose them.
Dael, you started in Pathfinder, as we famously know, but what was your first 5th edition experience?
I have genuinely no idea. No memory.
Fair enough.
I got nothing. I'm sure that I must have started somewhere. Don't know where that was.
Cool. Okay, fair enough. Were you the GM first or were you the player first? Do you remember that?
Probably. As far as I remember, my first 5e experience was running it. I think.
Cannot confirm.
Yeah. Mystery box ? But I'm pretty sure I ran before I played 5th edition.
Fair. Shawn, what about you? Where did you start with 5e?
Well, it's a funny story. Do we have an hour, you said?
Yeah.
I was writing for 4th edition when 5th edition was being concepted. And they actually wanted to work some of the concepts that they were going to put into 5th edition, especially on the adventure design side, into some 4th edition products. The very last 4th edition product that Wizards of the Coast published was Halls of Undermountain, where they gave me instructions to start working in some old school adventure design feel, because that's where they knew they were heading for 5th edition. So I would say that Halls of Undermountain, even though it was a 4th edition adventure, got me into the mindset of 5th edition in terms of adventures. They did the same thing with their D&D Encounters program. They transitioned from 4th edition to D&D Next. And so I did 2 of those encounter seasons where I was definitely experimenting with not even close to 4th edition types of adventures, hoping to get that 5th edition feel into people's minds. And then they made a D&D Next, which was what the playtest was called, book, where they published the most recent rule set that they had given for playtesters, as well as a longer adventure called Ghosts of Dragonspear Castle. So I did some design work on that. Then, when 5th edition actually did come out, even before the Player's Handbook was released, I had written an adventure for the Adventurers League, which was Wizards of the Coast's organized play, called Defiance and Flan. And so if you were a 5th edition player who got into the Adventurers League, the very first adventure you played may have been Defiance and Flan, which I ran many times, not only after it was released, but as a playtest. I must have playtested it with 5 different groups, so many different ways, to make sure that it came out as needed.
Is Defiance in Flan the... Because I've run a Flan adventure, and it's like an hour and a half, like real intro style adventure where, you know, you run it at a con in a 2-hour slot, and it basically just introduces people to a social encounter, an investigation, and a combat. But it was a part of like a collection of similar adventures that, like, one was a dungeon crawl, and the one that I ran was like a harper who asks you to deliver, I think, a dragon egg, and then Did you write that?
That is exactly it, yeah.
That's great, because I use that encounter to start campaigns all the time. I'm like, I don't know how to start this campaign. I kind of know where we're going, but let's have this guy ask the party to deliver MacGuffin to X group, and bam, you know, conflict. So
I think there's a very strong case to be made for Defiance and Flan being the most played 5e adventure of all time. I think there's a very strong case to be made.
yeah, right. I suppose you probably... Because I would have said, and I'm surprised that nobody has said this, although obviously the three of you have your roots a little bit deeper in 5e than I do, is Lost Mines of Phandelver. That's what I hear constantly, people kind of coming back. Even after Dragon of Icespire Peak was released, I feel like I've heard positive things about that, but can't remember having a conversation with anybody about Dragons of Icespire Peak. But everybody talks constantly about... I've just blanked on the name 30 seconds after saying it. Lost Mines of Phandelver.
I was just chanting that we should let you steward it, that no one was to help you.
Great. Thanks. Awesome. Speaking of starter adventures, I didn't know this had happened. Apparently it happened in February, but it was a bit of a stealth announcement from Hasbro, who were announcing that they were bringing out, you know, all the new toys and different things that they're going to be releasing during the year. And kind of snuck in among that announcement, one of the images was for what appeared to be a new D&D 5e starter box, which is called Dragons of Stormwreck Isle. There's not a lot of details about it yet, except for presumably it will feature a blue dragon because that's what's on the cover. And there's also a bit of an online theory about this being linked to the 80s D&D cartoon, because some of the player characters that are represented on the box art and on the internal pages that we've seen so far look a little bit like up-resed, modern, grittier versions of those cartoon characters.
Yeah, I've watched it all. When I was really getting into 5th edition, a lot of the people on my feed grew up with the 80s cartoon and were like, it's so good. And I was like, okay, I'll watch it. Well, it's a kid's cartoon.
Cool.
No offense. I mean, it's a kid's cartoon. It's a pretty decent kid's cartoon. And I don't know. I always felt like the world in that cartoon was, you know, incoherent. And that's not a criticism, more as a statement of fact. And so, I don't know. I don't have much.
Rest in peace, the cartoon. Oh, that was more brutal than anything else could have been.
I hope no one takes this review
I don't mean it as
seriously.
a criticism. It's just a fact.
It's exactly what it needed to be for that cartoon.
Sure.
So no malice in my voice.
It did seem like a very He-Man was successful. Let's try He-Man, but Dungeons and Dragons, and there's sort of nothing that exists within the world of He-Man except for the conflict between the two rival sides.
Yeah. So I you know, there was a car commercial that came out a little while ago, a couple of years ago, that featured those cartoon characters as human actors, which I think was rad. I think those characters are really well designed. I think they're really fun character designs. And if they're being repurposed as pre-gens or NPCs or whatever for the new starter adventure, I think they've already got a vein of gold to mine. If they wanted to take, you know, some of the memorable concepts from that cartoon and do something that has a more sort of cogent story with it, I think people, both, young who don't recognize it and just appreciate a good story, and I almost said old people, and fans of the cartoon. Wow. I've got no filter today, I guess.
No, go on,
James
please.
woke up and chose violence.
I guess I did. And people who grew up with the cartoon would love to see their favorite characters brought back in a more, I don't know, not like edgy, but adult context.
No, absolutely. It was, the comparison in my mind was like between Toon Link and like Breath of the Wild Link, where there's a bit more fidelity to the characters as they seem to appear in Stormwreck Isle. Is Stormwreck Isle a known place? Like, is that somewhere in the Forgotten Realms, or does this sound like it's being made up specifically for the adventure? I'm seeing a lot of head shakes, so...
I've never heard of it.
Sure. What do we think makes a good starter adventure? Specific, like Shawn, who wrote Defiance in Flan and helped kind of birth 5e adventures. What do you think is important to feature in a starter adventure?
I think you need pre-gen characters, first of all. There's a great debate about how best to introduce new players to the game. Some are like character creation has to be, because otherwise the players won't like their characters. But I think to really get into the game quickly, pre-generated characters are important. And not just that, the pre-generated characters need to be tied in to the threads of the story that the adventure is going to tell, because that gives the players something to grab onto. Even as they swim through these rules that they may not be familiar with, they can at least know that they have a background that links them to the story.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely in terms of using pre-generated characters. Having introduced a lot of people to 5e over my time, the approach to it that I've always taken has been like a video game tutorial, right? Where you sort of start, you do a basic explanation of like, these are the skills and these are the ability scores and this is how a D20 works. And then you go on to, I'll explain combat when you get into a combat, and I will explain, how social encounters work specifically when you start to talk to someone. And then when you're in an encounter for the first time, whatever it happens to be, you go, all right, these are your options. This is what you can do as you, interact with this specific moment. And one of the fun things about introducing new players to the game is seeing that slow smile come to their face when initially it's very unhelpful to tell new players, I think, you can do anything in a given situation, because it's like, well, they can freeze up. But when you start to get just a little bit deeper into the game, they know they can attack, they know they can hide, they know they can, they can do those things. But then you open it up and you can do anything. And they realize that they literally, the game can go off the rails depending on how they want to interact with the game. There's like a pure joy that comes to new players' faces when that realization dawns on them.
Yeah, it's equally important, I think, for these starter sets to not only be good for players, they need to be great for game masters, for dungeon masters.
100%.
And it's funny because that's one of the drawbacks. I love Lost Mines of Phandelver from the starter set, but one of the drawbacks is it doesn't do the best job it could with helping a game master. The first thing you do is the goblin ambush, and that's good. It's laid out well. But then it's sort of, there's two paths, and it doesn't tell the game master which path is best for the players or the game master. So you could go to the goblin hideout, or you could, just as equally prevalent, go to Phandalin. And once you get into Phandalin, then all these other things start happening, and it doesn't tell the game master, this is the best way to introduce your character to a new town. Because there's a quest board, there's also the inn you can go to, there's also a band of ruffians who are skulking about, and so it's not clear to a game master how to handle it. For another project, I've been reviewing the first adventure of 4th edition, which is Keep on the Shadowfell, and that has its own problems, but what it does really, really well is explain to the game master, here is how you handle these different situations, and then it leads them through it. And then the game master is ready to take on the rest of the campaign based on those introductory tutorials.
I'm always really torn when it comes to starter adventures because I know that I have a lot of people who want to play who will be more interested in the sort of extended sort of multi-session thing. But I also am very firmly of the belief that the best way to hook new players in with a starter set adventure is a one-session thing that hits just all the beats, which is so unusual for me because I like things to be coherent and to really flow together. But I want a starter adventure to be like maybe 4 hours, and I want it to have a puzzle, I want it to have a trap, I want it to have some riddles, I want it to have combat, and I want them to fight a dragon. That's like, boom, 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 boom. Like my go-to starter adventure is always, if I'm recommending, I say the Pathfinder Beginner Box. I think that one it's ludicrous. Like it doesn't really make much sense if you stop and you think about the story, but it just hits all the things that players might be interested in. And so by the end of it, they're all ready for more, which I think is kind of the ideal.
Yeah.
You raise a really good point about one-shots here, Dael, because a lot of the adventures that I see recommended for new players, that being either the starter set or the essentials kit or occasionally Sunless Citadel from Yawning Portal, is that these are all really good adventures, well-crafted ones, but it's really hard to get one sort of complete vertical slice of all the cool stuff that D&D can do in them. They're just kind of made like any other adventure. And so when it can be kind of a hard sell to get people into wanting to commit to campaign play right from their very first experience. Like if I wanted to bring my parents into D&D, I would want to show them a full vertical slice like the Pathfinder Beginner Box.
Because you want to be able to, you could get people to agree to one night of D&D if they've never played before. You can get them to agree to that. It's very difficult to say, okay, for the next 3 Fridays, we're going to play for, 2 to 3 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of starter adventures in my back pocket that it depends on the context of the group, depending on which one I'm going to use. So if I'm going to use, if it's just a one shot, it's an event at a local pub or a tavern, or something like that. I know that these players, I'm never going to play with them again. It's a convention. I definitely have adventures that are like, this is great because it has a combat encounter, a puzzle, a climax, so to speak, opportunities for social encounters and kind of questioning NPCs. So it covers each of the bases. It's relatively open as well, so the party get a taste for the fact that they're not getting funneled down a single corridor. They can kind of choose what they do themselves, but there's also opportunity for consequence if they make a mistake, and that teaches them that the game kind of reacts to them playing with it. But on the reverse side, I had really good memories of Lost Mines of Phandelver, and I hope that I don't come across as patting myself on the back too hard here, because I opened it with a big social encounter with Rockseeker. Gundren or something like that. His name is.
A name burned into many people's minds by some silliness in the Adventure Zone, I think.
And so, our first session had that social interaction, and then it had the combat interaction of the goblins on the road, and then it had the investigation of figuring out, what happened to the caravan after the fact, and then the traps were triggered when they were following the goblin path, which they just so happened to sort of choose. And I actually think Lost Mines is a good adventure if you're going to play a longer term campaign, if you know you're going to have 3 or 4 sessions with these players, because it sort of gives a good scope of what all of what D&D can be within the stretch of the adventure. I suppose my 2 criticisms of it is, I remember looking at Cragmore Castle for the first time, and I was like, they go into this room and they fight some goblins, and then they go into this room and they fight some goblins, and in this room they fight a Grick, and it's not a goblin, and I was like, all right, we'll scratch this, get rid of that, reduce the amount of pure combat encounters that occur in this place. But I like it because it's remixable. You can take Cragmore Castle, can completely retextualize it, and it's to the north of Phandelver, which is now called this, and the mines are over here. Like, it's kind of like a DM toy box to be able to just, if you want to homebrew with Phandelver, it gives you a lot of locations that you can then connect in in different ways that you want to?
I feel similarly about, this is fortuitous, because last week, after last week's Eldritch Lorecast, where I said, I want to run more for my family, my mum said, we should play D&D this week. We're going to play it all week. We're going to play D&D. And it was all very exciting. It was great. And I was like, I do not have time to prep something of my own. So I will actually go and I will read Dragon of Ice by a Peak. And I will run Dragon of Ice by a Peak. And of course, very, very quickly, that became me doing what Ben is talking about, looking at it going, I like that, I don't like that, let's scrap this, let's change that, let's move this over here, let's do that, which is, it's what I want to do. But, it had a lot of cool stuff in there. And of course, it ended up being that because of scheduling conflicts, even within one household, we could only make one night work. And I had notes that were like, I'd taken Dragon of Ice by a Peak and broken it down into sort of like 3 simple phases. Like, I'm sure we can get through this. And then it turned into one night. I was like, all right, one night only. Let's do this. How can we crunch this all down? And it ended up being like 2.5 things from Dragon of Ice by a Peak. But it was a lot of fun.
How does I Spy Pig go, do you think, in terms of a starter adventure? How does it stack up against Lost Mines of Phandelver or the Pathfinder adventure you mentioned? And what are the key ingredients that you think it has that perhaps Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, would ideally have as well?
What I really liked about it was that it starts you off and it just goes, you're going to keep coming back to the quest board. And we will have, 3 things available for you on the quest board, and you get to pick what thing you go and do. And after you do this many of them, more of them will appear. And the kind of cool thing about that is that it really organically does that sort of perfect slice that James was talking about, because they get to pick what they want to do. They get to go, there's a giant terrorizing a farm or whatever. Let's go and fight that. Or they can go, there's a mystery to solve. Let's go and they get to sort of curate their own interests, which is really, really handy. And I just think it's a good structure for newbies to be like, here's some quests, go and do them. They're all short, and then they build up into something bigger.
Yeah, this is similar to Phandelver. I remember, go look at this spooky abandoned village that has a dragon in it, or go and look at this castle, or go fight these orcs. It's kind of, it has an open worldness to it, and I think it does a good job of teaching GMs how to create open worlds in some capacity, where it's sort of similar to what you've said before, James, in terms of rivers and streams. Pools. There we go.
Rivers and streams.
It's just one long stream.
How are they
it
different?
Just keeps going.
You don't know. There is a difference, but we won't tell you yet.
Speaking of rivers and streams, rivers and pools. Speaking of rivers and pools, Fables episode 4, Land of Despair. If you're not familiar, Fables is
sounds like a sad place.
It does. Yeah, Land of Despair doesn't sound like the sort of place you want to go holiday, unless you are emerging from the city below, and then it might seem like a nice holiday by comparison.
And indeed, you do not want to go holidaying in the lands of Astoria. It is a place where only tragedy rules.
If this is your first Eldritch Lorecast or you're not up to speed, Fables is Ghostfire Gaming's episodic adventure module that we've been releasing. James, what can you tell me about episode 4, Land of Despair?
Yes, episode 4 is the beginning of the second half of our very first Fable. And it is the very first time in this whole adventure that the player characters have emerged above the surface. They've escaped this sort of dark underworld from the city below, which resides beneath the realm of Astoria. They're actually in places that, if you've read Grim Hollow, the campaign guide, you will have known about. It's a familiar territory that I think people have been itching to get to, rather than the new and exciting but unfamiliar realms, the dungeon below. There's been a lot of talk about the Asturian Empire in the Grim Hollow community. I truly think it's one of the most popular and intriguing lands in all of Atharis. People love their vampires because the lands of Astoria are ruled by vampiric aristocrats. And the reason why they're able to do this is because the sun has disappeared from the sky in an event called the Darkfall, which Ben joked about at the very beginning of this podcast. The sun vanished from the sky only above the Asturian Empire, and then from the depths of the earth, vampires swept out, conquered the mortal races, and created an empire of their own. And in this sort of land of eternal night, where only the moon brings light to the surface of the land, there are a lot of villages, some free of the direct influence of vampires, other ruled by vampire viscounts and other sort of minor nobility. And all of these little towns and other areas have their problems. Much like Phandalin, like we were talking about, though this isn't a starter adventure, you'll roll into town and you'll find that things are deeply unhappy there. And because this is Grim Hollow, you definitely can't make the Asturian Empire a happy place, but you can stop people from being, indebted to a troll-like creature that has stopped up the river, or save hunters from dryads that are fighting back as their woods are being encroached upon. Sarah Madsen, the author of this piece and a veteran of 5e adventures like Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, did a really good job with this very open world, sandboxy adventure. It's a sandboxiest of everything we've done in Fables so far, because there are 3 different villages that the player characters will want to go to learn information and gather resources before they head to Novostoya, the capital of the empire, the city of gargoyles, in a very, very nasty place. And ultimately, in true dark fantasy fashion, there are some hard choices that await you in this episode. If you roll into town expecting to be big damn heroes and solve everything, you'll roll up and kill the monster and everyone will be happy. You may find that things are not that simple in a world like this. Even the worst creatures, even the most vile things, who do just truly selfish acts of nastiness to the normal humans, you'll find they have their reasons for doing so, and they have their place in this world. And ultimately, you may come down on the side of humanity and say, well, no matter what this monster says, the fact is I support mortal creatures, and I will protect my own. And those are the kind of questions that we want you to ask in a setting like this. Is it even possible to find resolution between groups of living, thinking creatures that are diametrically opposed? And if you've watched a show or played a game like The Witcher or Dragon Age or Game of Thrones or any dark fantasy series like this, you'll find that the answer is a resounding sometimes. There are certainly points of goodness and light to be found in a world like this, because even the real world has a spectrum of good and bad in it. You'll find that it's a sort of moral, ethical quandary sandbox as well. So if all of that sounds appealing to you, I don't know. I really recommend that if you're listening to this, you check it out. It's a great adventure. I was the lead designer on it. I oversaw its production. I was the managing editor as well. But I want to give a lot of credit to Sarah Madsen, who just knocked it out of the park. Sorry,
no, go
one
ahead.
last thing. I can't stop talking about this. I'm very proud. But even if you haven't played any other adventure in the Fables series, if you're a fan of Grim Hollow or a fan of dark fantasy in general, this would be one to grab a la carte. This one, and I think the one that follows it, the Novostoya city adventure, that is a pretty direct sequel to what happens in this one in particular. They make a great pair for just a good, solid, classic Grim Hollow dark fantasy experience.
You said The Witcher. That was you, not me. And it's also just, I love Astoria. I've loved the concept of Astoria. This fable, even just at the start of it, I was starting to give it a read. It starts to give a lot of lore and answer a lot of questions that people might have from the campaign guide. It gives more detail to Astoria as a realm. And so even if you're just running your own Grim Hollow adventure and you want the players to visit Astoria, like you said, this is a great adventure to just be like, all right, we're gonna spend some time in Soma, and we're gonna, here are the villages, here are some quests that you can do. It captures the atmosphere really strongly, and basically I think I will end up running this. I have a party who are in Grabenstein at the moment on the Burak side of the Grey Spine, but they're planning to go over to Astoria before too long, and this is like perfect. It's like, yep, grab this, put it down, there's your adventure. What level are the players when they come into this adventure? Because they've done the first 3 episodes.
If I recall correctly, this begins at 7th level. And because it's a
Okay.
very open world sandboxy environment, everything is fairly well balanced towards 7th level. Open worlds are a bit of a tricky thing to do. Honestly, even in video games, you can like automatically scale content, Skyrim style. It's a tricky thing to manage. But we feel very confident that game masters will be able to adjust the difficulty of challenges presented in this adventure on the fly. The first one that you do, the first village that you go to in this adventure will probably be a challenge for the players to get through, which is good. Dark fantasy is at its best when it's pretty brutal. And then they'll get some sort of heroic momentum towards the end of it, which is good. Once you're near the end of it, you want the end to come quickly. You want to really boom, hit it hard, and then move on. So by keeping everything at a fairly level state, we have that sort of intensity curve that starts brutal, ruthless, and then becomes kind of a swift roller coaster into the next part of the adventure.
Dael, you spoke before a little bit about approaching open world design in terms of Dragons of Icespire Peak, giving the party kind of points of interest and different quests that they get to choose their own fun. Is this your general approach to sort of doing open world design?
Probably. This is a really weird thing that I've just never thought about, actually. I guess so. I've never been, a lay the map out and just make people choose person, because I firmly believe that a little bit of structure goes a long way towards freedom. So I often like, letting my players know the general idea of like, if you can do this or you can do that. And then hopefully they can start just sort of going, well, we can do whatever the hell we want, and we're not going to do either of those things you asked us to do. But I think particularly if you're dealing with early game stuff, it's good to have stuff to choose from. Because we talk about, giving players choice. And I think sometimes that comes across as, they have to have a million things to choose from so that it feels like, the real. But I don't think that that's what that means in terms of game design. I think giving players interesting choices actually often means giving them, a choice between 2 or 3 things, and letting them, choose between those. I think that often winds up a little bit easier and friendlier and more fun than them all. Like, I mean, imagine coordinating that. You've got, 5 people, they all want to do different things. Like, even if they actually got it together and were like, oh, we're gonna do something that we choose, I feel like coordinating 5 different desires, you'd end up just splitting the party and doing a bunch of different things, and it just gets really hard. So yes is the answer.
There is a hard there's a contrivance at the start of any campaign, especially if you're trying to create this open world feeling. I feel like the campaign that I'm running at the moment has actually been one of the worst starts to a campaign I've ever masterminded before, because the intention was, here's, Grand Theft Grabenstein. Here's this open city where you can go do whatever you want. Here's like 7 different things. Here's all these taverns. Here's all these, here's everything you can do. Like, make the city yours. And the players start level 1 in the tavern, and they're like getting all these rumors, and there's 7 different things to do. But the problem is, unless you have, some sense of urgency to it, the experience has been nobody knows what to do. They're all just kind of like, what's important? Where should we go?
John Travolta gif.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. Shawn, do you find that that you have that early, or you've experienced that early campaign kind of like, why are we all sticking together?
Especially love the idea of the sandbox, of the completely open adventure where they can do anything until only conflict is interesting. So unless they're introduced to a conflict, they wander around looking for the conflict that they need to fix. So it's better. When I run my home games, we do the session 0 and we say, your characters are all part of blank. What is it? We are playing Fables, and the characters are a traveling circus. And they were traveling through Astoria trying to bring some joy to the joyless. And so that's right. That was their shtick. And quickly and easily they were performing, and someone mysterious came up to them and asked them to do something for him. And that's how they got into the adventure. So, right, give the players something to think about, give them something to do, but put the conflict directly in front of them as quickly as you can. No one wants to read a novel where for the first 100 pages, the characters are wandering around doing nothing. Maybe Ulysses, but that's the entire book. So, it's think about what storytelling means to you and your group and do the thing that is most important.
I'm curious because we're starting to dive a little bit into, open world adventure design. And we talked last week a little bit about, dungeon design. And my approach with adventure design and dungeon design is, fairly structured, but always asking myself, is there a second choice? And that's, at the end of the day, that might be all you need. You don't need to provide 4 or 5 options. It's just, here's the objective. Yeah. Is there a second choice? And that, in dungeon design, it's like, here's the entrance to the dungeon. Is there a second entrance that the party could discover if they want to explore a little bit further? Which leads me to thinking about Zelda dungeons, which often are fairly open. James, I promised last week that you'd have the start of the episode, but I think we've still got most of an episode. And because this conversation is leading quite nicely there, I thought I would give you the tee up to talk about Zelda dungeons and your love for them and their influence on your game design. Go.
So nice to me, Ben.
Go.
Zelda dungeons are awesome. They were my main exposure to dungeon design when I started playing D&D. I didn't have a background of like Baldur's Gate or something like that, or Dragon Age, or a classic computer RPG in that style. Zelda dungeons are just as much puzzle boxes as they are combat gauntlets. And the best Zelda dungeons, in my opinion, are ones that aren't just a series of a series of small puzzle rooms, one after another. They are kind of in the way an escape room is an interconnected puzzle, where things you do in one room might have effects in other parts of the dungeon. People love to complain about these ones because they're often hard and obtuse, but water dungeons in Zelda are the clearest example of this, where you activate a switch in one room and the water level of the entire dungeon either rises or falls. And all of a sudden that opens up new avenues of exploration or new ways to fight the monsters in a certain room, right? If there are fish monsters in one room, draining the room of water leaves them entirely vulnerable and able to be attacked without any fear, stuff like that. Or a water wheel starts moving and then you can move through the water wheel instead of being blocked by it. These are dungeons that you need people to be in a certain mindset to play with. If you've got a group of D&D players who just want to fight monsters and go through a combat gauntlet, you don't want to design an interlocking puzzle box dungeon. That's just the way it is. This is a tool in your toolkit. But I found that by studying Zelda dungeons and looking at why I like them and what excites me about them, reveals a lot of things about how to make a good dungeon in a role-playing game. That first thing I talked about, the puzzle box, might be the main reason I like them, but it's one tool in the D&D toolkit. Another thing is the best Zelda dungeons have really strong themes to them. Sometimes people can get a little bit worn out of a simple fire temple, water temple, forest temple sort of thing. It's kind of a cliche at this point. But one thing that does it really focuses what the dungeon is about. And all of the puzzles are aesthetically based around where you are. Twilight Princess's Forest Temple has a situation where you need to cross a very long bridge. You need to collect 5 doodads in order to get across the bridge. And that's any dungeon can do that. Any dungeon can make it so that you need to get stuff from every corner of the dungeon so you can access a new pathway. But what this one does is there are monkeys that have been locked in cages throughout this forest dungeon. And in order to get across the bridge, you need to create a long swinging chain of monkeys by freeing them all throughout the dungeon. And once you've got all 5 monkeys, they'll form a line, you can jump on, and you will swing across like a trapeze artist onto the other side. And that's sort of a thing that in D&D, you'd be like, I won't force my players to do my monkey puzzle, right? You don't want to say, this is the one way to solve the puzzle. That's the thing video games will do. You have to find the answer that they're looking for.
Because, of course, as well, video games have limitations on stuff. So, of course, it's easier to solve those kinds of puzzles.
You can absolutely do this funny monkey puzzle in a D&D game. You just also have to be open to the possibility of them doing something weird and creative and bypassing it entirely, or using the monkeys for another purpose. Maybe the monkeys, if the players decide, I don't know what to do with these monkeys, can I use them for animal messenger, stuff like that? And then be like, okay, well, great. This is a use for the monkeys that I hadn't anticipated. I'll sort of reshape my idea of what they need to break down the dungeon. There's a reactivity to what you're doing. But as Churchill said, plans are useless, but planning is essential.
There's one of the most important tools in your game design toolbox, adventure design, is what I call circular design. So it is, you're somewhere, you see the situation, you go through something, and then you get back to where you were before, but you have new information, maybe new equipment. So you think of the Legend of Zelda, the very first game, right? You go all over the map, and then you get the Ring of Strength, and you can begin pushing things. Then you go all over the map again. Then you get the candle, and you're allowed to burn trees, which opens up secrets. And that sort of design is very useful in storytelling and in role-playing game design, because it gives you the power to let the characters learn these cool things based on the progress that they're making, and it completely switches their view as it goes.
One thing that modern Zelda dungeons from the game Twilight Princess onward really like to do is create hub and spoke style dungeons, which is not unique to the series, but you'll enter from one path and you'll find yourself in a big hub room, and you will find yourself with several passages to choose from that sneakily the dungeon designers have either created all the paths to be something that you could go to at the same time, and you'll go for a little bit, get a thing, come back, and eventually you have to go through all the paths. Or they'll do something where each hub has to be explored in sequence, and they just aren't saying, they just haven't written numbers on the door. There will be some obstacle that you can't pass until you've done something, like pressed a switch or found an item or a power in another one. I think the smartest hub and spoke style dungeons are ones that disguise the fact that their spokes are discrete. And they can do this by having the spokes wrap in on one another. Basically, again in Twilight Princess, I like coming back to this one. There's a dungeon in the desert where you'll enter the hub room and you'll go through one path, and by the time you've returned to the hub room again, you're no longer... you didn't just turn around and come right back. You kind of continued along a path, exploring as you go. And the time you've returned to the hub room, you're on a little catwalk 50 feet above the ground. And you might not even notice that you've returned to the hub room at this point. But they've turned you around so effectively and putting you in a different sort of vantage point of where you are in the room, that it feels like something brand entirely new, even though they've just reused the exact same room from before. And this also lets them, for example, if there's a switch to press on the higher level or a box to drop or a ladder to activate, if you ever mess up later on, you have suddenly a quick route back to where you're headed, because now you can just go from the main entrance right back up and around and back into the next room.
What's really cool about that sort of design is it's not just exploration and it's not just combat. Social encounters can work the exact same way. The story where you start in the tavern, you leave the tavern to do some things, you come back to the tavern with new knowledge, and you realize that this server who you thought was just a simple server is now someone else, and you see the situation in a new way, and you have the information that lets you unlock something else, and you keep coming back until the final big battle may take place in that very same tavern that you thought was your safe home at the beginning of the adventure. So don't sell the circular idea short for just puzzles and exploration.
I often treat, almost everything in the way that I design adventures like some sort of dungeon, like thinking about it like a dungeon with rooms. And it might not literally be that, but it crystallized for me when I was trying to design like a forest. I was like, all right, the party are going to go off into this forest and there's going to be, things to do in the forest. But I'm like, how do I make this forest feel open? Because a forest doesn't have walls technically. Unless it's a Fable, the video game forest, in which case it very much has walls. But hypothetically, there's no walls. But also, how do you make it feel like when the party are in a forest or a desert or something like that, that they are making choices rather than just having encounters placed in front of them kind of one at a time. Now you're in the forest and you encounter this. Now you're in the forest and you encounter this. And the answer that I came to was basically treating it like a circular dungeon where it's like, all right, you get to this room in the forest and there's this encounter, whether it's a landmark or it's a monster or it's a social encounter. And then when you're done with this encounter, it might nudge you towards the next encounter, or you might be able to hear the sound of water over here, or you can smell something coming from this direction. Here's 2 new things to explore. Go and find, which one do you want to explore from there? And that pushes them further through the forest, and they might still be able to hear the sound of water from the next room that they go to, so they can kind of find their way back if they want to whatever the water encounter is.
Because ultimately the dungeon is a metaphor, right? Like that's the thing, that once you have that realization of like, oh, if I'm planning, I don't know, a series of combats in a fort or, in a forest, like I still use the same process that I would use if I was plotting out a dungeon. Once you realize that, you start realizing that it's a metaphor for everything. And you can have any part of the adventure follow that sort of sequence that you would ordinarily use.
The seeing through the matrix moment for any game designer, and by extension DMs, is that everything is flowcharts. It's just that dungeon rooms are flowcharts with maps.
Literally, where's my thing for Dragon of Ice Spire Peak from the other day? Sorry, the book is right here, and I can guarantee you that I made a flowchart. It's my flowchart.
I remember some early advice. I think this came from WebDM, from Jim Davis, who was talking about visual maps has become very popular with online play because it gives the players something to look at and something to engage with. And I think that they're great. I do enjoy coming up with visual maps, but they are a lot of work, especially if you want something in high fidelity. You can spend hours in World Anvil or Incarnate or whatever your software of choice is designing this map, when in actuality, you can create, entire cities that are just flow charts or concepts of locations and arrows that point, the tavern has 3 arrows that point off of it because there's rumors that will point them towards the sewers or towards the castle or towards the, outside of the village. And then those will have, arrows that kind of come off of them.
The first thing we do in my writing for role-playing games class is interactive fiction. And if you use the right software, what does it create for you? It creates the flowchart of everything. Yep. And then you say to the students, what does this look like to you, for those of you who are into role-playing games and play a lot? They're like, it looks like the map of... Yes, it looks like the map of a dungeon, doesn't it?
Twine's a good program. Yeah, people should make games with Twine. It's fun.
Twine's good.
Absolutely.
I think it's almost an answer to travel as well. I just mentioned my players are in Grabenstein.
Not almost. It is. It is the answer, Ben.
They're in Grabenstein at the moment. They're about to move over probably into Astoria. They might choose to go elsewhere, but I'm starting to think about what I want the journey through the Grey Spine to look like. And in the past, travel has been challenging because it is, here's this encounter now, here's this encounter. It just feels like the DM kind of putting things in front of you until you've reached your destination. And now I'm thinking, all right, what I'm going to do, the Grey Spine is like this huge mountain range. What if I just create this map that has mountains, everywhere, and paths through the mountains, and here's a village up here, and here's what looks like a cave network, and it looks like it might be quicker to go through the caves because it bypasses a large bit of mountain, but if they go through there's going to be some challenges there, so, they have the option of going up and around or whatever they want to do, over the mountains or through the Mines of Moria, so to speak. Yeah, so use flowcharts.
One's safer but longer, the other one's shorter but more dangerous.
Or,
Wait, this is a good question. How the hell do you do safer but longer or shorter but more dangerous in a tabletop RPG? This is something that I've struggled with a lot in doing travel encounters. How do you represent that in a way that isn't like boring, like just get us to the next fun thing already?
Well, I think that you need to treat travel like it is the fun thing. Right? Like if they want to just get to the next fun thing, then travel's not important to the story, right? It's them going from Weathertop to, or maybe not Weathertop to Rivendell. That's a bad example because, but maybe from like, you know, the Prancing Pony to Weathertop, you know, like that distance is not important to the story. So it's kind of like, you know, montaged through. But
I design it like it's a dungeon, right? Like the flowchart comes back, but I think it just often ends up meaning that the challenges they face on the longer but safer journey are more likely to be social challenges. I'm more likely to have the players have interactions with each other, have it be those, you know, campfire D&Ms and things like that. You know, focus on the social and the, you know, the exploration elements. Whereas if you take the shorter but more dangerous path, then it's probably going to be more emphasis on combat. And the combat is probably going to be a bit tougher than you ordinarily would expect for your level. You know what I mean? Like I'll just ramp up the difficulty a bit. And I mean, ideally, I also like to put some kind of external pressure on it so that the choice makes a difference, you know? I want there to be a reason that you might want to get there quickly, because otherwise, why would you do that? Right. You know, even if it's, for example, Dragon of Icespire Peak, I said that, you know, there's a dragon in this area and everyone knows that where there are dragons, there's treasure. So all these mercenaries are coming into town and they're all racing to get the dragon, and you as a party are also trying to get to the dragon treasure first. So there's this element to it all where it's like, okay, but we have to do it quickly because what if someone else gets to the dragon? You know, any little thing that just creates a tiny little sense of external pressure so that the choice has meaning.
I think it's also just providing the players with the choice of what systems they want to engage with. So if it's the going through the mountain pass, but it's known that it's guarded by monsters, or going through the Mines of Moria versus going to a village that's, you know, close by, it's kind of not really asking the players necessarily whether they want to get to their destination quicker or not, but asking them what game systems do they want to engage with. Do they like combat? Do they like dungeons and caves? Let's go through the caves. Do they like intrigue and they like social encounters? Or do they just want some downtime for a bit? Let's go to the village instead. So it's, you know, there might not actually be a difference in difficulty per se, even though the narrative presents it that way, but it's more just what do you find fun? And what systems do you want to engage with as a result? I hope that was satisfying for people. James, we got a lot of requests in the comments on YouTube and via email for your Legends of Zelda dungeon discussion. So
people are interested. One of my greatest game design resources, dungeon design resources, is a series called Boss Keys, presented by a YouTuber named Mark Brown. He runs Game Maker's Toolkit. His Boss Keys series started out as a look at every single Zelda game's dungeon design, and he goes into great detail, drawing maps and flowcharts and, you know, item progressions of all of these dungeons and how they work, types of like categories these dungeons fall into. He eventually goes on to talk about other games, Super Metroid, Dark Souls, Castlevania, and there is so much good TTRPG knowledge, even though he's talking about video games, and he's really talking to video game designers. If you have your mind in a TTRPG headspace, there's a lot about dungeon design you can glean from this Boss Keys series. I highly recommend it. I send it to people who are designing dungeons for me all the time.
Yeah, even just like playing video games, if you're a fan of video games, can be great. I remember going back and playing Skyrim for the first time since I had started DMing for Dungeons and Dragons. And I was like, and this is personal opinion, but I was like, these dungeons are terrible. Like, they feel epic, and they have the feeling like they're these great big places that you're exploring some of the time when it's like a main quest big tomb, but they're really just like room after room after, like there's no choice to be made within those dungeons. They're just big long snakes that then snake back on each other and you're back at the start of the dungeon so you don't have to walk all the way back through the snake again. And so I think, learning a lot from Zelda dungeon design, Metroid dungeon design, and then comparing that and realizing what Skyrim is trying to do to trick you into thinking you're exploring and making choices is interesting. It's an interesting comparison from a tabletop RPG perspective.
Well, and part of that is that their goal might be a different thing, right? Because Skyrim really was selling the overland open world. It was saying, when you are up here, you can go wherever you want. So there's a little bit less emphasis on the destination because the journey was the big selling point for Skyrim.
Well, I'd like to go back and compare with Oblivion because, Oblivion was the game that was out when I was in high school. It was kind of like the formative Elder Scrolls for me. I know for my brother and his generation, who's a bit older than me, it was Morrowind was kind of that for them. So everybody kind of has their version of Skyrim. But I remember Oblivion quest design just being so much better than Skyrim's because it leaned into the skills of the specific guild or faction or whatever that you were supposed to be representing. So, the Mages Guild had magic puzzles, and the Thieves Guild, the final quest was to go steal something, and the Fighters Guild, you had to go fight some dudes. The Dark Brotherhood, you had to go and assassinate people, and they set up these really intriguing quests. I remember the quest where you get locked in a house and you've got to kill everybody in the house without them discovering that it's you who's knocking everybody off. It was incredible. And I would be curious to go back and play Oblivion for specifically the dungeon design, the way their dungeons are laid out, and to find out if they are as linear as Skyrim's are, because I feel like Skyrim is, in my personal opinion, so much less of a game because the quest lines are shorter, and the end of the Thieves Guild quest line is go kill a dude,
You were going to set off decades-old internet wars with comments like these, Ben.
Good.
Cities will burn because of what you said today.
Now you're making me nervous. I hear the Dark Brotherhood is good in Skyrim. I've never played to the end of the Dark Brotherhood's timeline or quest line in Skyrim, but other than that, I was unimpressed with the Thieves Guild. Anyway, that is all we have time for on this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. If you enjoyed this podcast, or if you want us to answer a question, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. We didn't get around to any questions this week, but we will definitely next week. Or go out and spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast. We are here every week, I think, Wednesday in the States and Thursday in Australia. We are here. So spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast, and we will see you all again next week.